Arrogance and insecurity, two sides of the same coin. The illusion of who you think you are. Have you ever had a moment when you felt completely confident, almost untouchable, like you were ahead of everyone else, like you finally had control? And then, without warning, something shifts. A comment, a comparison, a quiet realization, and suddenly, that confidence disappears. You feel smaller, uncertain, exposed. What changed? Did your abilities suddenly vanish? Did you become less intelligent, less worthy, less capable in a matter of seconds? Or was that confidence never as stable as you thought? We like to believe we understand ourselves. We label our emotions. We categorize our personality. We say things like, "I'm a confident person. I'm just insecure sometimes. I have a strong ego. I lack confidence." But what if none of these labels actually capture the truth? What if arrogance and insecurity are not fixed traits, but shifting states of the same unstable foundation? Because if you pay close attention, you'll start to notice something unsettling. The same person who appears arrogant in one situation can feel deeply insecure in another. The same voice that says, "I'm better than them," can quietly whisper, "I'm not enough." And both voices come from the same place. Arrogance is loud. It needs to be seen. It needs to be heard. It needs to be recognized. It says, "Look at me, notice me, validate me." But beneath that noise, there is something much quieter. A fear. A subtle, persistent fear that says, "If I'm not better, then what am I?" Insecurity, on the other hand, is quiet. It hides. It withdraws. It avoids attention. It says, "I'm not good enough. I shouldn't try. I'll just fail anyway." But beneath that silence, there is the same fear. If I'm not enough, then what am I? Do you see it? Different expressions, same question. Both arrogance and insecurity are attempts to answer a question that was never clearly understood in the first place. Who am I? And instead of exploring that question directly, we look outward. We measure ourselves against other people. We compare achievements, appearance, status, recognition. We build an identity based on where we stand in relation to everyone else. But this creates a problem, a very fragile problem, because if your identity depends on comparison, then it will never be stable. There will always be someone better. There will always be someone worse. There will always be someone ahead and someone behind. So where does that leave you? Trapped in a constant cycle of evaluation. One moment you feel superior. The next you feel inferior. One moment you expand. The next you contract. You are not grounded in who you are. You are reacting to where you stand. And over time, this becomes exhausting. You begin to chase moments where you feel above. You avoid situations where you might feel below. You carefully construct environments that protect your sense of self. But no matter how much control you try to create, life will always disrupt it. There will always be someone who challenges your identity. Someone more successful, more confident, more admired. And in that moment, everything you built starts to shake, because it was never built on truth. It was built on comparison. And comparison is unstable by nature. So the real question is not, how do I become more confident? Or, how do I stop being insecure? The real question is, why does my sense of self depend on comparison at all? Why do I need to be better, or worse, in order to feel like I exist? This is where the illusion begins to crack. Because the moment you stop asking, am I better or worse? And start asking, who am I without comparison? Something changes. At first, it feels uncomfortable because you've spent your entire life defining yourself through others. Without that reference point, you feel lost, undefined, almost invisible. But if you stay with that feeling, without rushing to escape it, you begin to notice something else. A quiet space. A space where you don't need to prove anything. A space where you don't need to defend anything. A space where your worth is not being measured. And in that space, something real begins to emerge. Not a performance, not an identity built for others, but something deeper. Something that doesn't rise when you succeed and doesn't collapse when you fail. This is where real confidence begins. Not as a belief, not as a mindset, but as a natural state that appears when comparison disappears. And yet, most people never reach this point because comparison feels necessary. It feels like survival. Like if you stop measuring yourself, you'll lose your direction, your motivation, your identity. But what if the opposite is true? What if the constant need to compare is the very thing that keeps you stuck, keeps you oscillating between arrogance and insecurity without ever finding stability? Because as long as your worth depends on position, you will always be vulnerable to change, and life is always changing. So maybe the goal is not to climb higher, not to become better than others, but to step out of the entire system of comparison. Not to win the game, but to realize you don't have to play it at all. And that realization changes everything. How the world taught you to doubt yourself. You were not born insecure. Read that again, slowly. You were not born comparing yourself to others. You were not born feeling less than. You were not born needing validation to feel real. As a child, you didn't question your worth. You didn't look at someone else and think, they're better than me, or I'm not enough. You simply existed. So what happened? Somewhere along the way, you were taught to measure yourself. Not directly, not consciously, but subtly, repeatedly, over time. It started with small things. Why can't you be like them? Look how well they did. You should try harder. That's not good enough. At first, these were just words. But slowly, they became something else. They became a mirror. And that mirror didn't show you who you were. It showed you who you should be. A better version. A smarter version. A more successful version. A version that always existed, just out of reach. And without realizing it, you began chasing it. You started adjusting yourself, polishing your personality, hiding your flaws, amplifying your strengths, not to express who you are, but to become acceptable. And this is where the split begins, because now there are two versions of you. The real you, and the version of you that is trying to be enough. The real you is messy, imperfect, unpredictable. The other version is controlled, carefully constructed, designed for approval. And the more you invest in that constructed version, the more you disconnect from what is real. This is the birth of the ego. Not ego as confidence, but ego as identity. An identity built to survive judgment. And once that identity is formed, everything changes. You no longer just live, you perform. Every interaction becomes a subtle calculation. How am I being perceived? Do I look confident? Do they respect me? Am I doing better than them? And without noticing it, you stop experiencing life directly. You experience it through a filter. a constant evaluation of yourself. This is where arrogance begins, because sometimes the performance works. You succeed, you get recognition, you feel admired, and in those moments, you don't just feel good. You feel elevated, stronger, smarter, more important. But what you're really feeling is relief. Relief that, for a moment, you are enough. But relief doesn't last, because the system you're playing in is unstable. The same world that validates you can take it away at any time, without warning. And when it does, you don't just lose status, you lose yourself. This is where insecurity returns, not as something new, but as something that was always there, waiting, because the identity you built was never solid. It depended on feedback, recognition, approval, comparison. So when those things disappear, so does your sense of worth, and you fall from confidence into doubt, from superiority into inadequacy. But here's the truth most people never see. You're not moving between two different states. You're moving within the same system. Arrogance and insecurity are not opposites. They are fluctuations. Fluctuations of an identity that was never stable to begin with. And the more you try to fix one, the more you reinforce the other. If you try to eliminate insecurity by becoming more successful, more attractive, more admired, you may reduce the feeling temporarily, but at the same time, you strengthen the belief that my worth depends on these things, and that belief is the root of insecurity. So even when you rise, you are still fragile, because now you have more to lose, more image to protect, more expectations to maintain, more pressure to stay on top, and beneath all of it, the same fear remains. If I lose this, what am I? This is the trap. The world teaches you to build an identity, then it rewards you for maintaining it, and punishes you when it cracks. So you spend your life trying to stabilize something that cannot be stabilized. An image, a role, a version of yourself that was never real. And the more you invest in it, the more disconnected you feel. Because deep down, you know the confident version of you is not always real. You know the insecure version of you is not the full truth either, but you don't know what exists beyond them. And that uncertainty keeps you stuck, because letting go of both feels like losing yourself entirely. But what if that's exactly what needs to happen? Not losing yourself, but losing what you think yourself to be, because only then can something real begin to emerge. Not an identity based on comparison, not a version designed for approval, but something quieter, something more stable, something that doesn't need to prove, or defend, or compete. And in the next part, we'll explore something even more uncomfortable: how modern life, especially social media, has amplified this cycle. How you are constantly being pulled into comparison without even realizing it. And why breaking free from this system is one of the hardest things you will ever do. The system that keeps you comparing. You wake up before your mind is fully awake, before you've even had a moment to feel yourself. You reach for your phone. You scroll. Faces, bodies, achievements, lifestyles, people traveling, people winning, people becoming something. And without thinking, you begin to measure. Where am I compared to them? Am I ahead? Am I behind? Am I doing enough? This happens so fast, you don't even notice it. But something inside you shifts. A subtle tension, a quiet pressure, a feeling that says, I should be more. This is the system. Not a system you consciously chose, but one you were placed into. A system designed to keep you engaged. And the easiest way to keep you engaged is to make you compare, because comparison creates emotion, and emotion keeps you scrolling. You feel inspired, so you scroll more. You feel inadequate, so you scroll more. You feel superior, so you scroll more. No matter what you feel, you stay. And over time, this constant exposure begins to reshape your mind. You are no longer comparing yourself to a few people in your immediate environment. You are comparing yourself to the entire world. Not the real world, but a curated version of it. A highlight reel, a carefully edited projection of people's best moments. But your brain doesn't fully register that. It reacts as if it's real. So now, your sense of self is being measured against thousands of lives that are not even fully true. Think about that. You are evaluating your entire existence based on fragments of other people's best moments. And then you wonder why you feel like you're not enough. This is where insecurity deepens. But here's the twist. The same system that makes you feel less than also gives you a way to feel more than. You post something, a photo, a thought, a version of yourself, and then you wait for the numbers, likes, views, comments, each notification, a small hit of validation. And in those moments, you feel seen, recognized, important, maybe even superior. But again, what you're feeling is not confidence. It's relief. Relief that you matter. Relief that you exist. Relief that for a moment, you are enough. But just like before, it doesn't last, because the next post might not perform the same way. The next moment might not bring the same attention. And suddenly, the doubt returns. Was it just luck? Am I losing relevance? Why are they doing better than me? And just like that, you fall again, from feeling above to feeling below. This is the loop. Comparison, emotion, validation, loss, comparison again, over and over. And the more you stay in this loop, the more your identity becomes fragmented. You start to build different versions of yourself. The version that performs well online, the version that feels insecure in private, the version that tries to keep up, the version that wants to give up. And switching between these versions becomes exhausting, because none of them feel completely real. You begin to ask questions like, who am I? When no one is watching, am I actually confident? Or just performing confidence? Do I really like my life? Or just the idea of how it looks? And these questions are uncomfortable. So instead of sitting with them, you scroll again. Not because you're curious, but because you're trying to escape. Escape the silence. Escape the uncertainty. Escape the feeling of not knowing who you are without comparison. But every time you escape, you reinforce the system. Every scroll tells your brain, this matters. This is how I measure myself. This is where my value comes from. And slowly, without realizing it, you hand over your sense of self to numbers, to reactions, to other people's lives, until one day, you feel completely disconnected, not because you don't have a life, but because you no longer feel it directly. You experience everything through a layer of evaluation. How does this look? Is this good enough to share? Will people approve? And in that process, you lose something essential: presence, the ability to simply be, without turning your life into something to be measured. And this is where the damage becomes deeper than insecurity. Because now, you don't just doubt your worth. You forget how to exist without questioning it. But here's the part most people don't realize. The system only works if you stay unconscious, if you never pause, if you never question, if you never step back and see what's happening. Because the moment you become aware, the loop begins to weaken. Not immediately, not completely, but enough for you to see that you have a choice to keep playing the game, or a choice to step out of it. And stepping out doesn't mean deleting everything. It doesn't mean rejecting the world. It means changing your relationship with it. It means recognizing, this is not who I am. This is just something I'm exposed to. This is not a measure of my worth. And that shift is where freedom begins. But awareness alone is not enough. Because even when you see the system, you may still feel pulled by it. The habits are deep. The patterns are automatic. The need for validation has been reinforced for years. So the real question becomes, how do you actually break free? Not just intellectually, but in your daily life? How do you stop the cycle when it feels like everything around you is designed to keep it going? That's what we'll explore in the next part. Not theory, not motivation, but real, practical shifts that begin to loosen the grip of comparison and slowly bring you back to something real. Breaking the loop. At this point, you see the pattern. You understand how comparison works. You see how it pulls you into cycles of arrogance and insecurity. You recognize the system, but awareness alone doesn't set you free, because even when you know what's happening, you still feel it. You still compare. You still react. You still get pulled in. So the question becomes, how do you actually break the loop? Not by fighting it, not by forcing yourself to stop comparing, because the more you resist it, the more attention you give it, and attention is what keeps it alive. So instead of trying to eliminate comparison, you start by changing your relationship with it. The first shift is simple, but not easy. You begin to notice, not analyze, not judge, not fix. Just notice. The moment you see someone more successful and feel that contraction inside you, notice it. The moment you feel the urge to prove something, notice it. The moment you check your phone, looking for validation, notice it. This sounds almost too simple, but this is where everything begins. Because most of your reactions are automatic. They happen so fast. You become them. You don't see the comparison. You are the comparison. But the moment you notice it, you create space, a small gap between you and the pattern. And in that gap, there is choice. At first, the gap is tiny, almost invisible. You notice the comparison, but still get pulled into it. That's okay, because the goal is not perfection. The goal is awareness. And over time, that awareness grows. The gap becomes wider. You start to see the pattern earlier, before it fully takes over. And in that moment, you can pause, not to force a different reaction, but to simply not follow the old one. This is the beginning of freedom. The second shift is more uncomfortable. You stop feeding the system. You start to question your habits. Not everything, just the things that clearly pull you into comparison. Mindless scrolling, constant checking, endless consumption of other people's lives. You don't have to eliminate them completely, but you begin to reduce them. Not as punishment, but as clarity. Because every time you expose yourself to comparison, you strengthen it. So reducing that exposure weakens the loop. This is not about discipline. It's about understanding. If you put your hand in fire, you don't need motivation to pull it away. You understand the consequence. In the same way, when you truly see what comparison is doing to your mind, you naturally begin to step back. The third shift goes deeper. You begin to reconnect with direct experience. Not how your life looks, not how it compares, but how it actually feels. Eating without distraction. Walking without thinking about where you stand in life. Working without turning it into a performance. At first, this feels strange because you're used to turning everything into something measurable. But slowly, you begin to rediscover something simple. Life is happening right here, not in comparison, not in evaluation, but in experience. And the more you return to that, the less power comparison has, because comparison cannot exist without stepping out of the present moment. The fourth shift is the hardest. You stop trying to fix your identity. You stop trying to become the confident version of yourself, because that's just another form of comparison, another ideal, another image to chase. Instead, you allow yourself to be inconsistent, confident sometimes, insecure sometimes, clear sometimes, lost sometimes, without turning any of it into a problem. Because the moment you stop labeling these states as good or bad, they lose their power. They become experiences, not definitions. And when they are no longer definitions, they no longer control you. This is where something shifts. You are no longer trying to be better. You are no longer trying to be enough. You are simply not fighting yourself anymore. And in that absence of conflict, something unexpected happens. A quiet stability begins to form, not built on achievement, not built on validation, but built on acceptance. Not the kind of acceptance that says, this is all I'll ever be, but the kind that says, I don't need to become someone else to be at peace with who I am. And from that place, action becomes different. You still grow, you still improve, you still move forward, but not from a place of lack, not to prove something, not to fill a void, but because growth itself feels natural. And when growth comes from that place, it doesn't create arrogance, because there's nothing to prove. And it doesn't create insecurity, because there's nothing to defend. This is what breaking the loop looks like. Not dramatic, not instant, but subtle, gradual, real, and over time, the swings become smaller. You don't rise as high into arrogance. You don't fall as deep into insecurity, because you are no longer attached to either. And in that space, something rare begins to emerge, a sense of self that doesn't depend on comparison at all. In the final part, we'll bring everything together, not as an idea, but as a realization, something simple, but powerful enough to completely change how you see yourself. Coming back to yourself after everything, after all the thinking, all the analyzing, all the trying to fix yourself, there is a quieter realization waiting. Nothing is actually wrong with you, not in the way you've been taught to believe. You were never too insecure. You were never too arrogant. You were never not enough. You were simply caught in a system that made you forget who you are. A system built on comparison, on measurement, on constant evaluation. And over time, you started to believe it. You believed that your worth could rise and fall. You believed that you had to become someone to be enough. You believed that you were either ahead or behind. But now, you can see it, not as an idea, but as something real. You can see how your mind moves, how it compares, how it judges, how it creates stories about who you are. And more importantly, you can see that you are not those stories. This is the shift. Not becoming more confident, not eliminating insecurity, but realizing that neither of them define you. Arrogance comes, insecurity comes. They rise, they fall, like waves. But you are not the waves. You are the one who sees them. And once you truly see that, something inside you becomes still. Not because life is perfect, not because you've solved everything, but because you are no longer fighting yourself. You are no longer trying to hold onto one state and push away another. You let both exist, and in that allowing, they lose their power. This is what freedom actually feels like. Not a constant high, not endless confidence, but a quiet sense of being okay. Regardless of what arises, you no longer need to feel superior, to feel valuable. You no longer collapse when you feel inferior, because your sense of self is no longer built on those movements. And from this place, something very simple, but very real, begins to return. Presence. You start to experience life directly again, not through comparison, not through evaluation, but as it is, a conversation, without thinking about how you're being perceived. A moment alone, without needing distraction. A small experience, without turning it into something to prove. And in these moments, you begin to notice something you may have forgotten. There is a natural sense of enoughness that doesn't need to be created. It was always there. It was just buried under layers of comparison. And as those layers fall away, you don't become someone new. You return to what was always there. Not a perfected version of yourself, not an ideal identity, but something more honest, more grounded, more real. You, and maybe that's the truth. No one ever told you. You don't need to become enough. You only need to see that you never weren't. So the next time you feel insecure, don't rush to fix it. See it. The next time you feel superior, don't cling to it. See it, not as who you are, but as movements of the mind. And gently, come back, not to an idea, not to an identity, but to this moment. Because this moment doesn't require you to be more or less. It only requires you to be here. And in that, everything is already complete.